We knew it was coming. The signs were all there. We knew we had to change, but we didn't. Destroying wild habitats, exploiting wildlife, turning a blind eye. Maybe it would go away. It didn't. It began to bite back. Primates and HIV, civets and SARS, bats and Ebola. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic, and it won't be the last. Unless we deal with the root causes. It's time to stop the wildlife trade and to support compassionate, sustainable farming to protect our planet. Let's change our relationship with nature forever. For all life on Earth.
Good afternoon. I'm Dominic Fulder, past president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, and I'd like to welcome you here today for this very important media briefing and report launch organised by Freeland and the Analytical Centre of Excellence on Trafficking. So we put together a very distinguished panel to discuss this important topic. One of the top 4 criminal activities in the world, worth I think about $20 billion annually. And this report sets out to see how that money can be recovered and used to actually repair some of the damage to the environment and nature. So we're joined from Jakarta on Skype by Nguyen Van Trong, who is the Secretary General of the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly, and she's taken a particular interest in this issue. From Thailand, we have Police Lieutenant Colonel Tirapong Duraya Vijan, who is the Acting Director of the Anti-Money Laundering Organisation Division 4. And we also have Police Lieutenant Colonel Paisit Sungapom, sorry, I've made a mess of that, but I'll get that, who is from the Deputy Secretary General of the Office of Narcotics Control Board, specialising in restitution laws in narcotics and related activities. So what we're going to do now is kick off with Steve Galster, who's here on my right, who is the international chair of Freeland, which and operates from Bangkok, and he's one of the people best versed in international wildlife trade anywhere on Earth. Steve.
Thank you, Dominic. Our pleasure at Freeland to have our distinguished colleagues from ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly and the Thai government join us today. Thank you very much. And we are, just so everybody knows, we're also on Facebook Live here. So if we can start with the presentation. Basically today that we are releasing a report, a study, and it's in different languages: English, Thai, Vietnamese, Khmer, Lao, and it's called Making Wildlife Traffickers Finance Wildlife Recovery. Next slide, please. First, what is the Analytical Centre of Excellence on Trafficking, ACET, and what's Freeland got to do with it? This is a data fusion center that we set up along with technology companies and other NGOs to fuse, analyze, and use data on trafficking. There's a lot of information on trafficking in the private sector. Everybody's got data these days, but washing it, fusing it, and making sense of it requires experts and technology. So we have help from IBM, from Celebrite, from Nuix, and we've teamed up with other NGOs, including the Mekong Club. We've gotten support from PMI Impact and other sources financially. And what we're doing is trying to bring this data together, recognizing that trafficking in people and trafficking in wildlife, the two of the biggest forms of illicit trade in the world today, combine them and you've got almost $200 billion a year in commerce. That the only way we're really going to bring these problems under control is to go after the money freeze it, and seize it. And what we offer today is the idea of not only going after the money of the wildlife traffickers, but taking it from them to use on nature recovery. So that's just a word about ASET. We provide our analysis, like the kind that you have today in different languages, to border authorities, investigators, lawmakers, behavior change experts, companies as well. And as you'll see today, we're also putting out reports on behalf of victims. Next, please. Also, in addition to doing these behind-the-desk analysis, we also get out to the front line and we provide training programs, including formal training and on-the-job training in asset targeting. That's a picture of Freeland trainers working with Thai investigators, bringing technology to their agencies or training them how to use it so that they can start to get faster at figuring out who's who in the zoo and where the money is coming from and where it's going. And we find that in the Thai government, actually, they've become some of our trainers, and we bring them to other countries because they're really, really good at this. And you're going to hear about that today. And it's an untapped weapon for good. Next. We'll speak about wildlife trafficking today. And as you saw recently in this case in Songkhla, it's a pretty serious business, right? There's still some mysteries around this case. We will not be discussing that case today because it's an active case. But it is a reminder that there's a lot of money being made in this, and there's some sensitivities around all of that. Next, please. What we've been noticing for the last 20 years that we've been here is there have been enormous seizures of wildlife, lots of live animals, but more and more dead body parts. And over the past 6 years, we've started to see some of the people behind these seizures. But first of all, some of these seizures, you have to understand, we see pictures of these in the newspapers or on the TV news. Like this picture here, those are pangolin scales. That comes from a 3 metric ton seizure that came on a commercial airline from Africa through Turkey into Bangkok. Thai authorities did a good job, found it, confiscated it. That represents at least 3,000 dead pangolins. And, that's just what was caught. These stuff gets through all the time. That's a lot of money. What we have started to see over the past 6 years, as I said, is using these data analytics and some of this technology to follow the trail of the seizures to some of the people behind it. And this is getting exciting, and it shows potential for us to turn the situation around. Next, please. For example, Freeland, working with the agencies I'm sitting next to now and South African authorities, use data analytics and cooperation to get information on a syndicate. This is a man named Chamlong Lemtong Thai, also known as Chai, who was sent over from Thailand on behalf of a regional syndicate to source lion bones, rhino horns, elephant tusks. And he did this for a while until the authorities started to follow the seizures and traced it back to this man. And they caught him. And he spent 6.5 years as a result in a South African prison. Next. Then there's this woman, J. Dao Rung Chai Mat, based in Chaiyaphum province from Vietnam, behind the smuggling and slaughter of countless tigers, leopards, pangolins, and other species, including rosewood, a case that Amlo worked on. I'm sure they'll speak about that later. Her assets, 1.1 billion baht, were identified, seized, frozen, some of it seized. She still, hasn't gone to jail. That's her on the right, boasting of her wealth. But there was some progress there. Next, these people, Chai and Jay, they would have been supplying several people, including this man. This is Vichai Gyalsawang, a Lao national, former Lao military intelligence officer, who once he retired, decided to use his connections and wherewithal, started a number of businesses, and this is part of the syndicate Hydra that moves a large part of the wildlife that's circulating through illegal trade in the world today. There is a $1 million reward still out by the US government for information leading to the dismantlement of his business. He's still at large. Next. Then there's Mao Chien. These are just examples of people who've actually been discovered and touched through the technology and the data analytics. This would have been a rival syndicate to Vichai's out of Vietnam. The NGO ENV Vietnam, working with police over in Vietnam, did a great job pinpointing this person. They caught him, prosecuted him, and he went to jail. His sentence is not very long, and the fine is not very big, but it was a landmark case, something that can be built on. And there's Bach Van Lim, a major wildlife criminal involved in other kinds of crimes also. He is from Vietnam as well, was in Thailand, but retreated when he knew that authorities were after him for some other kinds of crime. He's still at large. Mwazu Kroma, a Liberian national, catch me if you can character who has been trafficking huge amounts of rhino horn, pangolin scales, lion bone, etc. Finally caught thanks to the NGO Eagle in Africa, working with other NGOs, including ourselves and authorities, put the data together. He was extradited from Uganda. He's now sitting in an upstate prison in New York. That's another ongoing case, but that is in process, but they have put out media on this. And interestingly, that's a picture of him standing in front of a tiger farm in Laos. So these people get around. Next. Then there's Madi Konti, who is from the Gambia. He would have been moving lots of elephant tusks from West Africa and other parts of Africa through Malawi, where he had connections right in here to Bangkok, to Suvarnabhumi Airport, and then also into China. He had, as you see, an Interpol red notice out there. His partner was caught here by Thai police and Thai customs, and he's in Samut Prakan prison right now. Next. Then there's Bunchai Bak, January 2018. Thanks to cooperation by Freeland, ACET, Thai police, he was identified and arrested, brought to Bangkok, and went to court for the better part of 1 year. Unfortunately, the case rested mainly on one witness, and that witness turned their story, so he's off, he's free. Next. So, and then, the list goes on, although not that long, but this is, another sub-unit of a organized crime supply chain over in West Africa of Chinese, Nigerian, and other West African men who we helped catch through task forces in Africa. All the people that I just showed are not operating alone. They're part of a well-oiled machine. It's basically a business. And they all have legally registered companies in these countries. They're doing other kind of business that allows them to mask the illicit trade. And some of the legal trade that they're doing that masks this is legal wildlife trade, which masks a lot of illegal trade. Thank you. So now the thing is, some of those people went to jail, some didn't, but their organizations continue to ravage wildlife populations for three reasons. One, they held on to their wealth. So if they're out, somebody else takes over, they're still powerful. They can still pay and pay well. The number 111, well, they're all important. But the other thing we want to point out here is that governments around the world, and this event today is not just about Thailand. We're just releasing this report from here. This is a global study. Governments are not yet treating wildlife trade as a security threat, and we think they should be, because we have to remember that COVID-19 is a zoonotic outbreak, like many other outbreaks before: Ebola, SARS, HIV, MERS, bird flu, and people still arguing, did COVID-19 break out from a bat in a lab or from a pangolin in a market? if you look at what all the experts are saying, they're all agreeing that it's a zoonotic outbreak, which means it was transferred from a wild animal to a person, sometimes directly, sometimes through domestic stock. And the two easiest ways for these outbreaks to occur is you go into wild habitat and destroy it and bring people close to those wild animals, for industrial farming usually, or you take those animals to urban markets for sale. Those are the two ways. So, and the people that are doing it are some of the folks that we just showed you. So we consider them nothing less than terrorists. They are, next, inflicting more damage. COVID-19 inflicted more damage on this world than ISIS ever did. 44 million cases of coronavirus around the world, 1.2 million people dead, and this just started around the new year. And it's going to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately. And look at the amount of money that all these countries are spending on recovery packages. 21% of Japan's GDP. The United States, this is actually a slightly older statistic. It's up to like 16% now. That's an enormous amount of money. They reckon by the time, by the middle part of 2021, they're going to be looking at around $9 trillion worth of damage. And again, let's bring this back to the source. Everybody's talking about vaccines and recovery packages. We're not hearing enough about where did this come from in the first place? And what these people are doing, these organizations are moving viral bombs across borders, viral bombs from forest into marketplaces. It just takes one of these animals to be carrying a pathogen for which we have no resistance to jump from them to us, and you've got another outbreak. So we need to recognize that. Next. So, and then the other context to remember here is that law enforcement agencies that are working on this, the environmental agencies, and the conservationists like ourselves are really severely underfunded. Just struggling to make money, grants. These agencies are usually on the bottom of the totem pole in their hierarchy. And conversely, the wildlife traffickers, this is quick cash, high profits, so they can pay well and they can pay on time. So there's no secret as to why they're winning, and they are winning still. They're kicking our butt. We have to be honest about that as conservationists. We've slowed the bleeding and slowed some of the bleeding of the animals in the habitat, but it's still going in the wrong direction. And COVID-19 is a result of that. Next. So the report, we're pushing out an idea that already exists but has not been applied in hardly any country. There are a few on how to freeze and seize the wealth from the bad people and give it to the good people. Basically, it's called restitution, and it's helping out the victim. So the report, which again is produced in different languages, goes into this in detail. Next. The concept of restitution is already applied in other forms of crimes. You will hear about that from my fellow speakers in a moment. This is a report from the General Accounting Office of the United States on some guidelines on compensating the victims of federal crimes. So it's applied toward people from human trafficking or from other kinds of crimes. With wildlife crime, we propose that this start to be applied to traffickers as well, including the people that have been caught and that should still be caught. To require the defendant to reimburse a third party for costs incurred in remediating the harm. Basically what all this means is payback for the harm that you caused and restore the victim to whole. Next. The problem here is that we're talking about wild animals. Those wild animals can't go to court. They don't have lawyers. And it's hard to figure out who was all harmed in this and what was the economic damage. Like, how much do you pay? Thankfully, there are conservation organizations, some who are here, I believe, who are doing studies on what is the benefit of an Asian elephant or a pangolin or tiger to an ecosystem. we really need these animals. They all play really important, roles. A pangolin, for example, is a rototiller, an insecticide, and a fertilizer all rolled into one. They're eating ants and they're spreading nutrients. Each animal, like hornbills, plant trees through their poop. Elephants do the same. You take these animals out, you start to see. So we need to start seeing how can we represent the wildlife in court, how to get money, and where does that money go, and how do we spend it? Next. I'm just going to read one line here because this is really sort of how restitution works. Restitution generally is used as a civil remedy designed to prevent a wrongdoer from retaining any benefits illegally obtained from a victim and to make the victim whole through damages. I don't know how you make those victims whole, but you can imagine taking some of the money, in this case, and putting it back into elephant conservation to restore the population and the habitat, and the money should be going to conservationists and law enforcement agencies that help make that happen. That's an example. Thank you. Next. These are the three elements. The defendant has been enriched or has received a benefit. The enrichment of the defendant is unjust. The enrichment of the defendant was at the expense of the victim. Next. Now, I won't read all this, but the important thing to figure out here is there's three legal issues that are unpacked pretty well in the report. First is the legal basis, and the point here to make is what we're discussing, restitution, it should not take the place of other laws. It's an additional sentencing measure. Secondly, identifying an appropriate victim. This is the hard part, but we reckon it can be done, and it's already being done in some countries. Like if Hydra, the syndicate that we just profiled a moment ago, massacred a bunch of tigers in Thailand or elephants in Africa, who's all the victims? Clearly, the tigers and elephants are victims, but also so are the people of that country who are losing part of their ecosystem and money that may come in from tourism. You can put dollar figures on this and then move that money over to fix the problem. And that's where you tailor a meaningful remedy. And there's different ways of doing that. I'll show you an example. Thanks. Few countries have been applying this restitution on wildlife measures for a while, including Canada, the United States, and Australia. Next. Here's one case called the Bengus Case. United States found out that there was a company from South Africa in Cape Town that was importing enormous amounts of rock lobster being harvested off the coast of South Africa. They've been doing it for years. They had been under-reporting their catch, taking too much, paying off corrupt officials. And this is all coming into the United States and being sold on the eastern part of the United States. These guys were making a huge amount of money. Lobster, this kind of lobster, fetched a lot of money over years. The United States prosecuted them. They cooperated with South African authorities, and they used something called the Lacey Act. Long story short, they went after this company for $54 million. I think it was at one point pushed up to $100 million, and I think they got $39 million. Don't quote me on that, but it was a lot of money. And then the United States took that money, a huge portion of it, and sent it to South Africa and said in the court they deemed South Africa government, the people of South Africa were the victim because they were deprived of this fishing source. So that's the way this can work. It can work across borders also. Next. Now in Thailand, we don't have restitution being applied to wildlife crime yet, but it is being applied in other areas, which I'll let our fellow guest speakers speak about in a second. But it's something that we would like to see happen and help happen. In Kenya, they're close to it. They apply it for pollution. If somebody pollutes a national park, they will go after that polluter and figure out what was the damage done to that whole area, the communities, the wildlife, and they will fine it, and some of those fines are huge, and they put it back into restoring. Philippines is probably the closest to the model restitution we've been describing in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. Under their fishery code, they do mete out compensation schemes. If you go in, black coral fishing or anything illegal, sometimes they will slap pretty good fines and make sure that money goes back into a restoration project. But there's still quite a bit of work to be done in this region. I'll finish off here, though, with an example that we participated in. A lot of you probably have heard about or maybe even watched The Tiger King on Netflix. Well, 17 years ago, there was a case in the United States going after basically Tiger King-like folks. Those tiger breeding farms and exotic animal facilities have been around for a long time in the United States. The United States, which is the second biggest importer of wildlife in the world. Anyway, they went after some of these tiger breeders over there. They found out they were selling tigers out the back door, and they were being sold for the tiger bone industry. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted an undercover operation, found the guys, they were prosecuted, and they were made to pay a fine. We then applied for money from the fund, and we got $90,000 from those Tiger King-like traffickers. Brought it over here and put it to good use, working with the Department of National Parks, training up rangers, helping them find tigers over in the Eastern Forest Complex. And this is one of the best recovering Indo-Chinese tiger populations in the world right now. We put the money to good use. So that's just a local example. Next. So in conclusion, there's an awful lot of money out there. We talk about how big wildlife crime is, 20 billion or so. There's also $200 billion being made in a year on illegal wildlife trade, and a lot of that's mixed. We have the technology, and in some places the laws, and in some places hopefully the will to create laws that will allow us to go after that money, seize it, and put it into nature recovery programs. Because at the end of the day, if we want to avoid more pandemics, really the most realistic, sustainable vaccine is to prevent that from happening again by investing in nature protection. And this is a campaign that we have helped start and join with 35 organizations called End Pandemics. You saw the video at the beginning from that campaign. And this is what we're trying to do, is invest in planetary health. And every time we talk to people about spending money, during COVID especially, they're all like, oh, the money's all tied up. I lost my money, or the governments are spending it on recovery. Well, the traffickers still have money. And the best way to stop them and fund what we got to do, let's go out and drain their fuel tanks and fill ours, and then we can start to turn the situation around. So I would like to thank the main author of the report, Brianna Olson, who could not be here today, a lawyer. You should take a look at this report. I would also like to thank Ricardo Forrester, who's sitting over here, who helped out with the research on the report. And we have produced this in Vietnamese, Thai, English, Khmer, and Lao. Is that right, Ricardo? Right. And also, I would like to thank Laksana Kiratibong, who also known as Ying, for producing the report and laying out the design. You should take a look at it, who's also here today. Thank you. And that's the report, and we'll take questions at the end. I now turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Steve. And so just a few key takeaways. This is a massive transnational problem. Trafficking of wildlife, even larger as trafficking of human beings. We're seeing the decimation of wildlife globally, and along the way the spread of zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that move from animals to people. And we're also seeing the massive expenditure that governments have been exposed to in trying to resolve this problem, and the whole business of chasing after vaccines, which are completely unproven and may not come up. So there's a need for the governments to wake up to what Steve calls these viral time bombs, and to find a way of regulating these movements and, in fact, preventing them, and also of getting at the very wealthy, untouchable criminals who operate this thing. And as Steve has just pointed out, restitution is a well-established legal concept. So now it's a case of seeing how we apply it in new countries and get it to work in curbing the whole business of trafficking. So on that note, I'd like to go to Jakarta and Nguyen Van Tong, who is Secretary General of the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly, and she is particularly interested in this. So welcome to the FCCT. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Dear Mr. Steve Gunster, International Chair, Executive Director of Freeland. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. First of all, I have a great pleasure to attend this media briefing on making criminals and their dirty money pay for recovery of nature. On behalf of the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly, on behalf of the AIPA of the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly Secretariat, I wish to extend my warmest greetings and best wishes to all panelists and participants and audience of this webinar today. I also especially thank Mr. Steve Gunster, Executive Director of Freeland, for inviting me to join this event. My remarks will focus on first on how AIPA, how we perceive wildlife trafficking issues, and I also want to share with you my view on the restitution report that I received from Mr. Steve, and also some information about how AIPA has done to combat with the wildlife trafficking. So dear colleagues, the world has seen an alarming surge in poaching and trafficking protected wildlife species. This crime impact not just biodiversity, they also undermine the rule of law and affect economies and the livelihood of communities dependent on flora and fauna. Furthermore, wildlife crime generate a huge amount of revenues for criminal networks, often operating internationally. United Nations research estimated that the illegal wildlife trade is worth of more than $20 billion per year. Its devastating impact has resulted in first, the fastest rate of the species loss in history. Second, growing corruptions in enforcement chains across the world. Third, zoonotic outbreak like COVID-19 that threaten human health and global security. In spite of its devastating impact on wildlife and people, wildlife trafficking is not yet treated as a serious crime, as reflected by the low penalty applied in most countries and the lack of attention paid by enforcement and security-related agencies. I think a significant work needs to be done in each country in order to effectively tackle the illegal wildlife trade. Weaknesses exist in the principal legislation, including significant loopholes, variations on provincial implementation of national laws, inadequate penalty, and in some cases, extremely antiquated legislation, or legislation which is contrary to the country obligation under this site. Lack of capacity, poorly funded and understaffed enforcement agency, and limited prosecutorial power or experience. In some cases, a lack of political willpower, I think, also has led to insufficient enforcement action. One of the biggest issues faced by many wildlife law enforcement agencies in the region is the lack of prioritization and funding by the governments. This is especially true in ASEAN member states that are the developing countries. Dear colleagues, I read the restitution report which was given to me by Mr. Steve. I totally agree with you that to prevent this trade from causing further extinctions, weaken ecosystem and sparking additional pandemic, we need to make the wildlife trafficking high risk, low reward, and by making counter-trafficking more rewarding. One way to do this is by seizing profit derived from trafficking and reward high-performing wildlife protectors, and to finance wildlife protection and recovery efforts. Government and organizations have considered and initiated different strategies aimed at addressing these issues. The report focused on using restitution and supplementary sentencing measures to require wildlife offenders to pay for the harm they have caused on wildlife ecosystem and local communities. Funds can be channeled through government civil society partnership to implement recovery. Dear colleagues and friends, in many countries, the court are empowered to order restitution in addition to other criminal sanctions such as fine and imprisonment. This stems from the notion that fines and imprisonment don't contribute directly to compensate the loss suffered by the victim of crimes, which is in case could include state, law enforcement agency, natures, and wildlife. A possible solution may be for countries to establish a wildlife conservation fund whereby proceeds from confiscated assets of animals, of wildlife and criminals, as well as fines and damages can be mandated and order to be paid into this fund. The fund can then be used to support the cost of capacity building, enforcement, investigations, awareness raising, and behavior change campaigns, handling wildlife seize, reward to informants, and other costs towards combating wildlife crime. I think restitution is not a replacement of the criminal penalty and sanctions, but rather it is an additional remedy. The purpose is to combine punishments such as forfeiture of property, fines, and imprisonment with environmental protection and funding of victim compensation and assistance program. We need to follow the money in order to identify and disrupt the criminal network engaged in wildlife crime. Following the money requires that law enforcement agencies conduct financial investigations in parallel to or as part of wildlife crime investigations. It is necessary to implement adequate legislation and to ensure law enforcement agencies responsible for tackling wildlife crime are empowered to use it to chase, locate, freeze, and ultimately confiscate assets of wildlife crime. On the other hand, I think that building capacity and providing adequate resources to relevant law enforcement agencies, as well as interest and political will, have also a role to play in this process. Dear colleagues, strengthening relevant law and their enforcement remains the biggest challenge ahead. Therefore, the AIPA member parliaments have shown their effort to support governments in the creation of effective deterrents to illegal wildlife trade and the criminal syndicates behind it. AIPA legislators have supported enforcement efforts on the ground through discussions and dialogues with partners to pursue the review and analysis of counter-wildlife trafficking national legislations. The members of the parliaments in the region also share best practices and moral provisions among ASEAN states and with other countries around the globe. AIPA adopted a number of resolutions on strengthening law enforcement and regional cooperation to combat wildlife crime with Freeland in 2007 and 2009. The MOU concerning the cooperation between Freeland Foundations and the AIPA Secretariat was first signed in 2015. In 2012, the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly issues a resolution calling ASEAN ministers to prioritize combating wildlife crime, which was followed by AIPA participation in ASEAN regional consultation, which led to the issuance of the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on Transnational Organized Crimes. The declaration upgraded wildlife and timber trafficking as priority agenda item. In 2017, the AIPA caucus organized a working group on Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species and Wildlife Protection in Jakarta, Indonesia. And after that, the AIPA General Assembly Organizational Committee meetings also adopted a resolution on a regional cooperation to fight wildlife trafficking in Philippines in September 2017. AIPA, in coordination with a number of stakeholders such as Freeland, USAID, conducted consultation on efforts to counter wildlife trafficking through legislative reforms and reviewing the wildlife-related provisions. This exchange of view encouraged ASEAN member states to employ legislation and policy as tools to combat wildlife trafficking through providing modern laws and key innovations that are effective in deterring wildlife trafficking. Partners hope that AIPA member states will incorporate this law and create a strong regional legislative framework to combat wildlife trafficking. There is, I think, still much work to be done to combat the illegal trade of wildlife. Much work still needs to be done to strengthen legislation around the world, especially in Asia, and improve prosecutorial and judicial capacity and process. AIPA just adopted a resolution on the renewal of cooperation with Freeland on the 9th September 2020. And now it stands ready to work with Freeland to continue this important initiative to fight against the illegal wildlife trade. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing other views from the panelists and also the participant on the restitution report and exchange ideas with you later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before we move on, can I just ask you one very quick question? Given all the problems that governments and parliaments are facing in the region at the moment with the pandemic, economic setbacks, how are you trying to promote keeping this issue high on the agenda? Because it's a very urgent issue, but it's also one that people can overlook quite easily. So how are you getting parliamentarians to keep it high on the legislative agenda?
Thank you for your question. You know that the parliamentarians have, I think, 4 important functions. The first one is lawmaking. Second one, supervising the activities of the government. Third is make decision on the budget allocation and also representations of the people. So we also acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic has links with the illegal wildlife trafficking. And during the past few months, the ASEAN member parliaments have tried their best to let the people know about these important issues. We organize the webinars, the workshops. Some we already done with the Freeland to raise the awareness, not only of the MP, but we think that through the MP, the information will be conveyed to the people at the local level. And as you also know that member of the ASEAN also released the statement on how ASEAN cooperate with each other to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And last year, Vietnam was the president of the AIPA, and president also issues a letter to all AIPA member parliament to raise this issue and also to call upon the cooperation among all AIPA member parliaments. Between the legislative and also the governments, we maintain very good cooperation and very close cooperations in order to address and also combat with the wildlife trade, trafficking and also trafficking. And I hope that in the future, we continue our cooperation with Freeland and some other organizations to address these issues to the MP, to the member of the parliament, so that they are fully aware of the importance of these matters. And I also suggest, Steve, that we can also raise the issue of restitution to the MP, maybe in the next, I think in early next year, so that they are fully aware of this important matter. By doing so, I think that we can raise this issue among MP and also the local people, And I'm sure that we continue to discuss about these issues because we really think that this is the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll come back to Bangkok now, and Colonel Tirapong of the Anti-Money Laundering Office, who will give us his response to the report and talk about collaboration amongst NGOs in the area. Colonel Tirapong.
สวัสดีครับทุกท่านขออนุญาตพูดภาษาไทยเดี๋ยวให้พี่ปู่ช่วยแปลเป็นภาษาอังกฤษอีกทีนะครับจะเห็นได้ว่าจากภาพสไลด์ที่ขึ้นฉายก่อนหน้านี้นะครับจะมีการปราบปรามการล่าสัตว์หรือค้าสัตว์ป่าในหลายคดีที่เกิดขึ้นในประเทศไทยนะครับจะเห็นได้ว่าปราบเท่าไหร่ก็ไม่หมดทันทีก็คงคล้ายๆกับเรื่องยาเสพติดนะครับคล้ายๆกับเรื่องยาเสพติดเลยไม่มีผิดเลยนะครับคนขนก็จะเป็นคนกลุ่มหนึ่งนะครับซึ่งไม่ใช่คนที่อยู่เบื้องหลังการกระทำความผิดนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นปราบเท่าไหร่ก็ไม่หมดมาตรการทางกฎหมายที่เราใช้บังคับในทางอาญาเนี่ยมันก็ใช้ได้ในระดับหนึ่งนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นนี่ท้ายสุดแล้วเนี่ยถ้าเผื่อเขากระทำความผิดแล้วเขาได้ทรัพย์สินมาขบวนการองค์การเขาก็ยังคงอยู่เพราะว่าทรัพย์สินความร่ำรวยเขายังมีอยู่
Kumprani will very kindly interpret.
Yeah, from this slide you have seen earlier, you see that there are many wildlife trafficking in cases occurring in our country in Thailand. So even though you have tried to suppress the wildlife trafficking, but the principle, I mean the mastermind, still there and still enjoy his or her wealth. So that is the way the authority use. We call it the criminal measures that doesn't work so well, meaning that even though that person has been arrested or put in jail, he still got money for his family to enjoy it.
ปัญหาเรื่องการปราบปรามองค์กรอาชญากรรมในลักษณะนี้เนี่ยนะครับจะเห็นได้ว่ามันปราบปรามกันไม่หมดสิ้นนาทีเพราะฉะนั้นนี่มันก็เลยเป็นที่มาของการมีกฎหมายว่าโดยการป้องกันและปราบปรามการฟอกเงินซึ่งประเทศไทยนี่เป็นภาคีสมาชิกของอนุสัญญากรุงเวียนนา1988นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยประเทศไทยก็ต้องมีกฎหมายออกมารองรับเพื่อให้เป็นไปตามมาตรฐานของสากลที่เขากำหนดขึ้นนะครับในช่วงแรกในปี2542เนี่ยความผิดมูลฐานเนี่ยมีอยู่ด้วยกันแค่7มูลฐานความผิดด้วยกันนะครับกฎหมายฟอกเงินไม่ใช่เป็นกฎหมายฉบับหลักเป็นกฎหมายฉบับรองหมายถึงอะไรหมายถึงว่าเราจะเข้าไปดำเนินการกับทรัพย์สินที่เกี่ยวกับการกระทำความผิดได้จะต้องมีกฎหมายหลักบัญญัติว่ามีการกระทำความผิดทางอาญาอะไรที่เป็นความผิดขึ้นก่อนนะครับเราถึงจะเข้าไปดำเนินการตามมูลฐานนั้นได้
As I said that the criminal measure may be not very efficient, so that's why Thailand has enacted the anti-money laundering law, or you can call it AMLA in short. the reason behind of AMLA enactment because we at that time Thailand would like to become a party to the Vienna Convention 1988 and the requirement for being the member of the convention is that you got to have the anti-money laundering measures. So we enact the law and we established the anti-money laundering office. And in 1999, at that time we got only 7 predicate offense.
ในช่วงแรกที่7ความผิดมูลฐานนี่หลักๆคือมุ่งเรื่องปราบปรามเรื่องยาเสพติดเป็นสำคัญเลยนะครับแล้วก็มีความผิดอื่นตามมาหลังจากนั้นก็มีการปรับพัฒนากฎหมายขึ้นมาจนกระทั่งปัจจุบันนี้มีอยู่ด้วยกันอยู่ทั้งหมด29ความผิดมูลฐานด้วยกันความผิดมูลฐานเกี่ยวกับเรื่องทรัพยากรธรรมชาติที่มีลักษณะเป็นการค้าที่เกี่ยวกับเรื่องสัตว์ป่าก็ดีลักลอบค้าไม้ก็ดีอะไรก็ดีเนี่ยนะครับอยู่ในกฎหมายฟอกเงินที่มีการแก้ไขฉบับที่4เมื่อปี 2556
Earlier we concentrate our work only on the asset seizure or asset forfeiture relating to narcotic drugs offense. But of course the law has to be updated, in line with the current situation. Nowadays we have altogether 29 predicate offense. Of course, the offense relating to exploitation of national resources are included. So it is one of the predicate offense. We amended that in the 2013 that include this natural resources exploitation offense.
เจตนารมณ์ของกฎหมายฟอกเงินนี่ก็คือมุ่งตัดวงจรอาชญากรรมแล้วก็เมื่อการดำเนินการตามกฎหมายอื่นแล้วไม่เป็นผลนะครับจึงมีการตราใช้กฎหมายฉบับนี้ถามว่าทำไมถึงพูดว่าเจตนารมณ์แบบนี้เพราะว่าปัญหาเรื่องการดำเนินคดีอาญาเนี่ยจะสังเกตเห็นได้ว่าเราจะเอาคนผิดมาลงโทษได้เฉพาะคนที่อยู่ในลำดับใกล้ชิดกับเหตุการณ์ที่กระทำความผิดพอขยับจากแถวที่2แถวที่3ที่เป็นความเชื่อมโยงกันแล้วนี่การดำเนินการตามกฎหมายทางอาญาเนี่ยมักจะไม่สามารถลงโทษกลุ่มคนพวกนี้ได้นะครับคล้ายๆกับปัญหาเรื่องคดียาเสพติดไม่มีผิดเลยนะครับในส่วนนี้เรามีเคสที่ทำขึ้นหลายคดีแล้วจำลองแหลมทองไทยก็ดีนะครับดาวเรืองชัยมาศก็ดีนะครับกลุ่มพวกนี้ถูกเรายึดอายัดทรัพย์สินตั้งแต่ช่วงประมาณปี2556มาแล้วล่ะนะครับอย่างเคสของจำลองแหลมทองไทยซึ่งไปกระทำความผิดที่แอฟริกาใต้เนี่ยนะครับก็มีการยึดทรัพย์สินในประเทศไทยในความผิดมูลฐานนี้หรือเคสของดาวเรืองชัยมาศซึ่งตอนที่แอมโลทำเรื่องนี้เราไม่รู้จักเลยว่าดาวเรืองนี่เป็นใครนะครับไม่มีการจับกลุ่มดาวเรืองกับพวกของเขาพร้อมของกลางแม้แต่ชิ้นเดียวนะครับในวันที่เราเริ่มทำคดีนี้ไม่มีการจับกลุ่มคดีอาญาเกิดขึ้นแต่เราสามารถดำเนินการยึดอายัดทรัพย์สินของดาวเรืองกับกลุ่มพวกนี้ได้ในเวลาประมาณ14วันนี้เรายึดได้ประมาณ200ล้านนะครับประมาณ200ล้านซึ่งถ้าเผื่อจะเล่าเรื่องนี้ฟังเนี่ยผมไม่ได้เอาสไลด์มานำเสนอให้ดูเพราะคิดว่าเป็นเสวนาชั่วโมงคอร์สสั้นๆกันเลยก็ไม่ได้เตรียมมานะครับเป็นมีอะไรที่น่าสนใจมากโดยเฉพาะเรื่องการใช้กฎหมายฉบับนี้นะครับมันสามารถต่อไปถึงตรงนั้นได้เพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยวิธีการตามกฎหมายฟอกเงินดูเหมือนจะง่ายกว่าการดำเนินคดีอาญาแต่รายละเอียดของพยานหลักฐานความเชื่อมโยงค่อนข้างจะละเอียดมากนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยเรื่องของดาวเรืองจะเป็นตัวอย่างที่ดีว่าการดำเนินการกับตัวการที่อยู่เบื้องหลังนี้สามารถทำได้โดยใช้กฎหมายฟอกเงิน
I would like to touch on a little bit on the intent of the AMLA. The AMLA has been enacted with the intent to disrupt the cycle of the criminal activities, and only when other laws had become inefficient or ineffective. So we think that the AMLA can help in that process. You can see that when you undertake a criminal offense, you can catch only the principal, the key man, but other associate, you can't do anything with them. For example, in the case of Miss Dawrung Chayamat, is the name? When Amlo undertook this case, we didn't even know her. We could not arrest her. It's not our duty. We did not capture her at all, but we are able to seize, freeze, and also forfeit, confiscate her asset. That is, the value is around 200 million baht. That's quite a lot. I didn't bring the slide with me because I thought the talk today is gonna be short. And you see that the anti-money laundering law seems to be simple, but in fact, when we work with this process, with this civil forfeiture, we find that we got to collect a lot of evidence. We got to find a lot of linkage, to look for the asset, not only of the principal, but his family, his helper, or anyone. So we go quite a lot to look for the asset and seize them, freeze them. But we don't have any duty to arrest them.
จุดเริ่มต้นของเรื่องนี้เกิดขึ้นจากน้องชายเขาขับรถเอาเงินสดใส่ลังมาประมาณ4 ล้านบาทแค่นั้นเองไม่มีอะไรที่เป็นความผิดเราก็ขยายผลจากตำรวจตรวจยึดเงินเพราะว่าน้องชายเขาบอกกับตำรวจว่าเงิน4 ล้านกว่าที่ขนมาตอนประมาณตี 2เนี่ยเป็นเงินที่จะเอาไปซื้อไม้พยุงซึ่งเป็นไม้ห่วงห้ามตามกฎหมายไทยนะครับก็เขาให้การแค่นั้นจากแค่นี้ถ้าเผื่อในมุมของการทำคดีอาญานี่มันไม่สามารถดำเนินคดีอะไรกับเขาได้เลยหรือแม้กระทั่งจะยึดเงินไว้เป็นของกลางในคดีอาญาก็ทำไม่ได้ทางตำรวจนะครับเขาได้รู้เกี่ยวกับเรื่องกฎหมายฟอกเงินเขาก็ประสานมาที่ทางปปงว่าเกิดเหตุการณ์ขึ้นในลักษณะนี้แล้วเขาก็รับว่าเงินนี้จะเอาไปซื้อไม้แต่ยังไม่ทันได้ซื้อเพราะว่าไม้ที่ไปดูนี่ไม่ใช่ไม้พยุงเป็นไม้ชิงชันก็เลยหิ้วเงินกลับบ้านจากเหตุแค่นี้นะครับเราก็แนะนำตำรวจว่าให้ทำรายงานการสืบสวนนะครับบันทึกถ้อยคำบันทึกวิดีโอในการสนทนาที่เขาได้ให้ข้อมูลไว้เสร็จแล้วเราก็รีบช่วยกันระหว่างประสานงานระหว่างตำรวจกับเรานี่โดยเรานี่ก็ไปหาประวัติความผิดเก่าๆที่เขาเคยทำมาก่อนหน้านี้นะครับซึ่งก็พบว่าน้องชายของดาวเรืองหรือแม้กระทั่งกลุ่มดาวเรืองเองเนี่ยเคยมีประวัติการถูกจับกุมเกี่ยวกับเรื่องการลักลอบค้าสัตว์ป่ามาตั้งแต่ปี 2546 ในขณะที่เรื่องนี้เราทำปี 2556 เราใช้ประวัติเก่าๆพวกนี้มาเป็นตัวตั้งโยงให้เห็นถึงว่าพฤติการเขามีต่อเนื่องตั้งแต่ปี 46 เป็นต้นมานะครับเมื่อมีพยานหลักฐานพอที่จะทำให้เชื่อได้ว่ากลุ่มพวกนี้มีพฤติการเกี่ยวกับเรื่องการลักลอบค้าสัตว์ป่าเราก็เสนอเรื่องต่อคณะกรรมการธุรกรรมให้ยึดอายัดทรัพย์สินแล้วก็นำไปสู่เรื่องการส่งเรื่องไปสู่ศาลนะครับเคสนี้คดีถึงที่สุดแล้วศาลสั่งตกเป็นของแผ่นดินหมดแล้วนะครับ250 กว่าล้านนะครับ
the Miss Dawrung case, it start from. That is amazing. Her driver, her brother drove a car, and he had 4 million baht in his car, and the police searched his car and asked why you carry this much money. He said that he is going to use this money to buy rosewood. If you look at this, only this, the police cannot do anything because he said he's carrying money for some business, could not do anything. Anyway, luckily the police officer know that now we have the AMLA, the anti-money laundering law. So the police call the Amlo, the anti-money laundering office, and report that they have some suspicion about this guy's activity. So we asked the police to took some inquiries, ask him some questions, and record the video. And after that, the Amlo got the report from the police, and we start to look back at Miss Dao Reung and her family's history. They have some criminal background before, back to 2003, that they committed some wildlife crime. So the Amlo undertook investigation, and we proposed the case through the committee, within Amlo, we call it transaction committee, and the committee believed that there are, sufficient grounds to believe that this person committed the crime, the natural resources offense. So the process is from investigator to transaction committee, and then to the public prosecutor, and then to the court. And the court decided to forfeit the asset around 200 million baht to the state.
ปัจจุบันนี้เราได้มีการหารือร่วมกับทางฟรีแลนด์ในการดูเคสเกี่ยวกับในประเทศและก็ต่างประเทศจะพบได้ว่าขบวนการของดาวเรืองก็ดีบุญชัยแบ็กก็ดีจำลองแหลมทองไทยก็ดีที่ขึ้นภาพสไลด์ไปก่อนหน้านี้เป็นกลุ่มองค์กรอาชญากรรมที่มีความเชื่อมโยงกันเรากับฟรีแลนด์กำลังทำเรื่องนี้กันอยู่อย่างใกล้ชิดแล้วคาดว่าประมาณต้นปีนี้เราน่าจะมีข่าวดีเกี่ยวกับขบวนการนี้
At the moment, my office is discussing with Freeland also to examine the case in the country, also the case, international case, and we found that Miss Dao Reung, Mr. Bak are all the kind of organized crime, kind of organized crime group, and we believe that early next year we're gonna have some fruitful results of our investigation and our cooperation with Freeland.
เพราะข้อมูลของฟรีแลนด์นี่ค่อนข้างจะกว้างแล้วก็ทำข้อมูลไว้เชื่อมโยงกันมากพอสมควรในขณะที่เราเอาข้อมูลจากฟรีแลนด์มาเชื่อมโยงกันในแต่ละคดีและที่สำคัญก็คือเรื่องเส้นทางการเงินหรือความเกี่ยวข้องสัมพันธ์ที่เราพอจะหาได้จากฟรีแลนด์แล้วก็ที่เราหาเพิ่มเติมนะครับมันจะนำไปสู่เรื่องผลสำเร็จของการปราบปรามขบวนการค้าสัตว์ข้ามชาติซึ่งเรามองว่ามันเป็นขบวนการกลุ่มหนึ่งของคนที่มีอยู่กลุ่มหนึ่งในประเทศไทยมันเป็นเหมือนอาชีพเฉพาะทางที่ถ้าเผื่อคนนอกกลุ่มก็จะไม่ให้ความสนใจว่าไอ้ค้าสัตว์ป่านี่มันเป็นปัญหาสำคัญไหมเราก็จะไปมุ่งเรื่องอื่นๆที่มันกระทบกับตัวเรามากกว่าในขณะที่เรื่องการปราบปรามการค้าสัตว์ป่าข้ามชาติเนี่ยมันเป็นเรื่องที่สำคัญระหว่างประเทศที่เราควรจะต้องมาช่วยกันในการปราบปรามอย่างจริงจัง
We found that the information that we obtained from the Freeland is very comprehensive, and we can take the information to our analysis because we have the ability to do some financial tracing. We have the office called the Financial Intelligence Unit, so we do that analysis that we believe that we will be successful in suppressing these organized crime, and which is we think that is very important case.
เฉพาะที่เริ่มมีความผิดมูลฐานตั้งแต่ปี 2556 มาถึงปัจจุบันปปงแอมโรนี่สามารถยึดอายัดทรัพย์สินเกี่ยวกับมูลฐานทรัพยากรนี้ได้มูลค่าประมาณ 5,500 ล้าน
In terms of the value of the asset that we are able to forfeit from the offense relating to the exploitation of natural resources, the value from 1999 until the present is 5.5 billion baht. I don't know, it's a lot or just a little, I don't know. It's around 20 years since the establishment of our office.
Right, on that interesting fact, I think we'll just move forward because we're running a little bit late. So can I ask Compensating to tell us about the Office of Narcotics Control Board's experience with restitution relating to narcotics? So you're already there in part. And also your take on this report. That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone here. And first, I'd like to thank Kun Steve from Freeland to inviting me to speak from my experience regarding the drugs matters comparing to the wildlife crimes. As my colleagues from Amlo just said, that there is some similarities between drugs traffickings and wildlife traffickings. What it is that they usually works as the groups or as the organizations. There is the mastermind, there is a smuggler, there is the seller. The same between drug traffickings and also the wildlife traffickings. Secondly, they make a lot of profits. They make a lot of monies. That's some similarities. And also, however, one thing's the difference between these two crimes is that I think the people tend to look at the drugs traffickings more serious than the wildlife traffickings. Because of drug traffickings, we've been through for many years. However, for the drugs, for the wildlife traffickings, is something that we just, I think, the public just starting to pay attention for that, not many years ago. So this is something that we need to give them the public's educations that how serious is the wildlife trafficking are. Talking about the benefits, talking about the assets, that I said that is very crucial. It's very important for these organized crimes. In drugs matters, years ago, we tend to look at the criminals. We tend to give the importance to the criminal by going after them, arrest them, right? Put them in jails. We also looking at the drugs itself. We go and seize drug and then destroy that once we seize the drug. So these two things we've been doing this for many years, going after criminal, going after drugs. But now we are realized that doing those two methods, it doesn't work very well. So now we're trying to, we've been doing that, focusing on their assets, their properties, their monies, because we believe that once we can cut off their assets, properties, and monies, we hurt them. We hurt organizations and should be able to disrupt them, if not stop them. This is something that we've been doing that, and we put a lot of weight on that. What we are using, that we're using two legislations. We have the Acts 1991, that they give power to the officer to seize their assets, their property, their monies, and then ask them or let them to come in front to prove that the assets there that we seized, they got it legitimately, not illegally. So this is something that the burden of proof is on them to prove that they earn that money, they earn that property legally. This is one of the legislation that we use. The second legislation we also use, that also the Amlo Law that my colleague just mentioned. The Amlo Law is a good tool because with that law, we be able to seize their assets, their money, their property, even without the criminal conviction base. The first law, the first legislation I just mentioned, that we got to start from the criminal case first. Then we have power to seize their assets. But with the Amlo Law, we can start using that legislation, seizing their assets, seizing their property without a case. This is something that we use right now. We use those two legislations to work on that. And then you might wonder what we do with their assets, what we do with their property that we seize. In narcotics, in our legislations, we call the narcotic funding. So all the assets that we seize from the criminals going to this funding instead of going directly to the governments. This funding is in our responsibilities. It is granted by our law. We have set up committee to work on this funding. So the funding will be used in order to protect us. We can prevent, suppress, and rehabilitations, something to do with narcotics. We use that. And we can use this funding in terms of supporting our law enforcement, buying equipment for them, give them some trainings that they need, hiring advisor or lecture to work or to give them some knowledge on some of the cases, to hold seminar, to hold any event relating to that area. And also importantly, we can use this funding to help the officer who get injured from their duties or the person or the officer who even get killed in actions. This funding can also be used to help their families. Okay. And for the restitutions, the Kun Steve just mentioned that in our legislations, especially in the human trafficking law, there's an article to, give the power for the authority to use the criminal money to pay for the compensation to the victims as well. In human trafficking, they have that legislation, but for the narcotics, we don't have that. But we have we call funding that I just explained to you, to use for supporting the law enforcement to work against the criminal in the future. Thank you.
Just one very quick question. Do you, in your system of restitution, employ bounties? Do your officers get any benefit personally from the recoveries that they make?
Well, for the narcotic fundings, we also set up the money we call reward, not only for the officers, not only for the authority, but informants, anyone who come to us and give us some information, intelligence, then the money, they can also receive that kind of money we call reward as well.
Right. Time is running low. We're slightly late, but we have the additional problem of demonstrations coming on later in the afternoon, which people are going to run off and attend. So as usual, we have a microphone in the middle of the room. If you'd like to ask a question, there's time for 2 or 3. And if we have any online, if I could be informed of them. Don't all rush. Whilst you're putting on your running shoes, the Amlo figure was quite impressive, 5 billion in 20 years. That's a lot of money. I mean, that can do a lot of good. On the narcotics side, how much money have you been able to recover and get back into the system to work for you?
This is a good question.
Of course.
Last year, I think we have been able to seize all the assets and money altogether about 1,000, almost 2,000 million baht. But this year, our minister is aiming at 60,000 million baht a year in 2021. This is something that we have to be very, very serious. Okay. For our fundings, the funding that I talk about, we have almost 3 million baht that we use to assist all the activities concerning the suppressions, preventions, and rehabilitation of the narcotics. Okay.
Right. In the presentation, there was a fantastic picture from Laos of the IHT and the kingpin connected to Hydra, right? And obviously somebody with government connections. So there are 2 questions that arise about that. The IHT disappeared 5 years ago. This guy, maybe longer, this guy is still running around. So I'd like anybody on the panel who would like to comment on this subject is realistic timeframes. How long is it going to take for this stuff to get traction and start delivering results? Could we just have that from Jakarta first? Put you on the spot.
Excuse me that because the volume is too small, so I cannot hear your question quite clearly. Can you
I
say-
won't go into the whole question. I'm just talking about realistic time frames for getting traction. You have to get it through the parliaments. The executing agencies have to get up to speed. There are all sorts of problems. We have a crisis at the moment with zoonotic diseases, and we have no time to lose. So I really want to know from members of the panel what the realistic timeframes are for getting traction on these kinds of very practical suggestions.
I think that this issue we know that is very crucial and very important. But you see that we due to the pandemic, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course we are facing with a lot of challenges now. I think that in order to tackle the wildlife trafficking issues effectively, of course we need, the most important thing is the legislations. So you see the role of the parliament very important, and in order, as I already shared with all of you, that in order to put these issues on the agenda of the parliament, I think we need to increase the awareness of the MP so that they understand these issues very deeply. And I, from the point of view of Parliament, I also see that beside the principal legislation, I think we also need to have the cooperation of the ancillary legislation. It means that the legislation which deal with some other matters, such as money laundering and corruptions, etc. So with the and I think that the ancillary legislation can be the supplement to the principal legislations. And the other thing is that one of the important thing I also mentioned in my presentation is also depend on the political will of the leader. So in some country, you know, that lack of the political will, we cannot have the effective tool to combat with the wildlife trafficking. So the leadership is important, the legislation is important, and the awareness of the people are very crucial. So it's very much depend on those things. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the process, you know, that if we don't give the priority to the wildlife trafficking, I think the you know, that the criminals can take the opportunities of this situation to you know, that to make more benefit from the wildlife trade. So that's some of the point that I want to share with you.
All right, so I mean, basically we're talking about years, but we could use COVID-19 to force an acceleration if it's lobbied correctly. Do either of you gentlemen have anything to add on timeframes, or otherwise I'll take a question?
Yeah, I think I would just repeat what you just said. I mean, it could take years if we go the normal route, because laws take a while to reform or even create. I think it's great that we've got folks like Ms. Van from Secretary General of AIPA who's interested in this, and we can work together to push it there. In the meantime, if we want to fix this problem, you know, faster than a few years, because we're going through the fastest rate of extinction right now in history, and we've just had a pandemic which could last. We could even have another one which is worse. I think we need to make this a international security issue. I'm a national security buff, and I see way too often with all kinds of governments, they use national security laws for political purposes, for the wrong reasons. This is actually a real international and national security issue that we all should share. And, you know, not pointing fingers, the U.S. government, you saw in that IHT, the New York Times IHT article, the U.S. government 7 years ago announced a $1 million reward for information leading to dismantlement of that guy's business. We provided information to them 7 times, and nobody even picked up the hotline. And they admitted later, like, oh, they forgot about that. There's people working on it, but there's no government that's perfect on this, and that's why NGOs have to also enter this forum to work on it. Meanwhile, thankfully, the United States is about to put out like $1 billion new in post-pandemic recovery, much of which is earmarked for nature conservation, which is the right thing. And we'd love to see other governments follow suit. So, thank you.
Great. Reagan.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for the insights that you've shared. For the gentleman from Narcotics as well as Amlo, I'm curious if you can explain a little bit about whether there is much in the way of cross-border information sharing and collaboration, and if so, if you can explain what the mechanisms are, whether formal, informal, and whether it's on a country-by-country basis. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We ONCB, we have the good cooperations with our neighboring countries, especially the country along the Mekong River, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and also China. With those, we have we call the MOU, agreements between country, bilateral and also multilaterals. And also we, ONCB, have officer stationed in the embassy, in Thai embassy, or with all those countries, 5 countries as well. So we are quite capable to coordinate with our colleagues, our allies, informal and formally. Right now, today, we're still exchanging intelligence information together. Because of this COVID-19 pandemics, it's make it a little bit harder, because we usually have the meetings between the countries, like 3-4 months times. You know, we send officer there, they send officer here. But because of COVID, we cannot be able to, to go there. But what we did now, that we do a lot of Zooming, sharing information through emails and through the video conference and all that. But again, we have good cooperations, good partnership with our colleagues. Not only the 5 countries that I mentioned, we also have a good relationship with the another agency from a Western country, like DEA from United States, NCA from the United Kingdoms, Japan, Korea, and Australia. They're all good partnership with us. Thank you.
Right, Jonathan, quickly.
Hi, just very quickly. Jonathan Miller from ITN in the UK. Steve, first of all, very small one for you, just about those rock lobsters you mentioned. When you said that there was restitution and there were funds that ended up in South Africa, was that monitored, and what did that go into? Was it specifically into protecting that population of rock lobsters? On a broader front, I'd just follow up from that last question there about regional cooperation. Steve, in his initial address, talked about trafficking as being like a viral bomb crossing borders. Do you believe, and I know that the Thai government has done an awful lot in this regard in both policing and protection, and is working very closely with NGOs, among them Freeland, but do you believe that there is an understanding among the countries of Indochina and next door Myanmar, and within ASEAN more broadly, and there I'm addressing Jakarta as well, do you believe that there really is an understanding that given the experience of COVID and Trump's references to the China virus, that one day a zoonotic disease could start here in this region? And is enough being done and is enough being understood about just how dangerous that is?
Yeah. Well, first of all, so I'm not looking like I'm pointing fingers at any country in the region, but you know, I'm an American in the United States, second biggest importer of wildlife in the world. COVID-21 could start in the United States. There's a lot of wildlife trade there. And the more I learn about what the scientific community knows and doesn't know, the common denominator is they're saying, there's basically 1.6 million viruses out there in nature ready to be unleashed, half of which, that's 800,000, could inflict the kind of damage we've seen. That's a lot. And so the point is, leave those wild animals alone in their homes and protect Mother Nature, and she won't mess with us. So it could happen anywhere. Could it happen in this region, in this country? Yes. I mean, look, we've, lobbied. Jadocek Market is back open. You walk through there's all kinds of animals in cages next to each other. Birds, capybaras from South America, African gray parrot, they're all in close proximity. They could be peeing or defecating on each other, or things spread through the mouth. People can take those home as a pet. It just spreads. It doesn't matter if the animal's legal or illegal, because every time we talk about this to some particular authorities, they're like, oh no, it's all legal trade, which it's not. There's legal trade masking illegal trade, but more importantly, these are wild animals that could be passing viruses to us. Indonesia still has massive wildlife trade going on in the markets, including bats, one of the biggest bat markets in the world. After all this talk about bats, people still eating wild bats. And the list goes on. So there are ticking time bombs throughout this region for sure, but it's not only in this region, it's anywhere in the world that this is happening. So we really strongly believe that we need to ban commercial trade in wild animals. And we should be treating this like terrorism. We should be treating this like bionuclear warfare. And it's a huge business. It's hard to stop. And people are fighting against this idea of the ban, saying, oh, poor people need to make money from this. We cannot get in the way of livelihoods. We're not talking about banning hunting of deer or ducks or fishing or subsistence hunting. We're talking about commercial trade in wild animals, which has gotten way out of control, and there were people making money on, the slave trade supply chain. We still ban slavery. So we're at that point in history now where we need to say, hey, stop this. I think we had another
there was a point
over here.
Just back to cross-border information sharing. Just would like to I discussed with the speaker, and he said actually the domestic, information sharing is very, very important in Thailand because, for example, with the anti-money laundering office, we work quite closely with the police, and we have shared information with them. But some officers of the Ministry of Natural Resources, they don't even know the Amlo. If they know our role, they can coordinate and share information, so we can work better. But for the cross-border information sharing, we have very strong mechanism. We have the group of the financial intelligence units all over the world being the member, and we share information 24 hours a day. Thank you.
And I meant to add, you asked about the region. Ms. Van, who's on the screen right there, played an important role with the Prime Minister of Vietnam and the President of AIPA. The Prime Minister of Vietnam passed a directive on wildlife trade. We still think that there's some improvement to be made there, but it was a huge step forward, and we'd love to see more leaders of government throughout the world take those kind of steps. Thanks.
Great. Well, I'm going to wind it up. Do you want to tap any other nails on the head whilst you have the microphone? Is there anything that we've
No, I mean, I think we've
covered
gone over time, and we know that there's demonstrations out there, so we should probably close up. And I mean, I just want to thank our speakers for coming today and taking the time, and also including you, Ms. Van, from Jakarta. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, FCCT, for hosting us, Dominic, and all those who are watching on Facebook Live also. This has been recorded, and we can watch it again. And we have some gifts for our distinguished speakers. Thank you so much, President, for coming today. It's really great to see you. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. Fantastic. I really appreciate it. Okay.